Hi, welcome to Platonics, an RPG design show where we design sessions, not games. I'm Jordan.
And I'm Rocky. And we spend a lot of time in our day jobs designing and facilitating experiences for people. And this is kind of our attempt at using those powers for fun instead of work.
Every week, we pick an iconic genre or IP and think about what we would want to experience if we were the players at the table. And then we go about designing and delivering that experience as game masters. So, what are we going to chat about this week?
I am so glad you asked, Jordan. This week, we are talking about a book that we have both read recently, but I'm kind of hoping it will be a little bit of a springboard into a broader discussion of books or things like this. This week,
books or book-like things.
Books or fiction or other fictional objects. So the book that we read is Elder Race by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which is fantastic, and you should go read it. It's actually not very long. That's how I convinced Jordan to give it a go. And
I'm barely literate as it is.
The audiobook is also fantastic. I had a go at the audiobook when I read it for the second time, and the audiobook is like excellent. Elder Race is one of those books, and you've probably come across the idea before, where there are two characters living in different worlds. One of them is living in a fantasy world, and the other is living in a science fiction world. Except it turns out that both of these characters are actually living in the same world, and we're seeing the same action happen from two different understandings of the universe. So it's sort of half fantasy, half science fiction, and it really plays on that idea that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, which is something that Arthur C. Clarke pretty famously said.
It's probably worth mentioning that we're going to absolutely spoil this novel, and it is a little delight to read. So if you haven't, now's the time to pause, smash that out, and then come back to this episode.
Before we get straight into that, though, I did mention this is like part of, I wouldn't quite call it a genre, but there's a pattern of these kind of books. The other notable example is The Frugal Wizard's Guide to Medieval England, which is
Surviving Medieval
England. It's a mouthful of a title, which is a Brandon Sanderson treatment of the same topic. That one we don't like as much, but it covers a lot of the same ground. If you're an Ian M. Banks fan, he does a whole book called Inversions. That one I think is much more subtle than either of the ones we're talking about. So it's an idea that pops up all over the place, but I thought it would be interesting to talk about how you might do that at a gaming table.
Yeah, let's dig into like what are the important things about this type of fiction that makes it unique? What gives it its identity? I'd say the most obvious one is it has to have contrasting viewpoints. It has to have a consistent world where different interpretations can really put different flavors on actions or events that are occurring.
Yeah, and I think it's also important that both of them could be quote unquote correct.
Yeah, for sure. Like it's both very much consistent. There's a particular part of this novel or novella.
Novelina?
Diminutive novel.
Novelette. Small book.
Booklet. Long paragraph. There's a specific part in this long paragraph where there's the man, quote unquote, from the future. There's a technologically advanced man who's an anthropologist studying this primitive civilization of humans that has kind of disconnected off the main arrangement. And there's a particular moment where the technological man is explaining his viewpoint and the story of how a team of anthropologists has come here to study them. And at the same time, like adjacent to that is another column of text that's the mythical story of their origin as told by the person whose medieval viewpoint we're experiencing. And the two stories are synchronous and consistent, but the language is entirely different with really wildly different connotations of how those events occurred. Clearly, there's no magic in the technologically advanced man's world. All of that is explainable. But from her side of the story, when she describes things, there's much more element of awe and fantasy. And when the future man gets to the end of his story, she's like, yeah, that's exactly how we tell it too.
Yeah, so he thinks he's broken his big set of rules about not contaminating this other culture, and he spills out this story, and she's basically like, yeah, that's pretty much how we understand it, but all of those words over time have come to mean different things.
So the story is the same, but the lens is totally different and cast it in an entirely different light.
Yeah. What else do we think? What else is like an essential kind of ingredient of these types of stories?
I think there's got to be some form of, like, some display of magic that is easily explained by technology in there. Like something that primitive people will definitely perceive as magic, not science.
Yep. And I think the closer that is to something that is understandable by the people at the table, you know, your audience, I think the more impactful that's going to be.
Yeah. You don't want to go too far in the other direction where you're like, oh, it's entirely unexplainable with the words that you guys have, like
right,
the players have.
Unexplainable science to like us, the players, is just as mysterious as unexplainable magic. So you kind of want to keep the sciencey side of things within the realms of sort of comprehension.
Mm-hmm. There's a particular moment in here I like where while sleeping, the future guy is like set upon by a couple of people, and he like automatically attacks them back, then feels really bad about it, and is like, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do that. You've got pretty bad radiation burns, and you're probably sterile now. And the way that the characters in the fantasy setting read that is, you've put a curse on his line. You've destroyed his ability to bear children.
Yeah.
And I find that to be one of the most like poignant elements where we're really contrasting a relatively like, oh no, we said too many x-rays to his genitals.
Yeah.
But they're like, it's a curse that could never be lifted.
So I think another thing that shows up in these stories, and it kind of ties into that idea that neither of these worldviews is necessarily correct or privileged over the other, is that the wizard or the technological sort of the holder of the advanced technology is very much complemented by the skill sets of the other non-technological, non-wizard party members. So yeah, the wizard might be able to perceive things that the others can't. They might be able to interface with ancient technologies, but they're probably not as good with a sword as the local, right? They're probably,
or they don't know like the local customs and traditions, so they're going to
stick
their
out
ability
like a
to
sore
execute
thumb.
a social faux pas is unparalleled.
Yeah. So even though you would think there's this massive disparity between, you know, someone incredibly powerful and the locals who seem weaker, what you actually have is quite a lovely synergy between them, where you have this technological power that is nevertheless relying on local knowledge, local connections, and also often like physical brute strength to actually succeed at whatever they're trying to do. Like what else, what other experiences, what else needs to be in the story?
I think there needs to be a population that's fearful of the magician. I think they need to like be completely not understood, not misunderstood, but not understood by the dominant population.
Right. And then your other, I guess, members of the party are defined by their willingness, I think, to engage with the wizard, right? Like even coming up to the wizard or the wizards at all is...
It shows bravery or foolishness or both.
Right. So the people who are out in this story, in the wizard's sort of party, I think that's one of the things that made me want to discuss this, right? Is that these stories often fall into the like fantasy adventure tropes in that like there is a wizard, there is a quest, there is a party, and it's just the fact that there's these two different points of view on it that gives it like a little something extra.
Gives
so
it
like
je ne sais quoi.
Yeah. And so like in the books, there is a party. The wizard has a party. They are usually going on a quest.
Like the reason why the party has sought out the wizard is because the thing that's bothering them is not solvable with the means they already have.
Right. So I think that's the other thing, is that the threat that they're up against has to be something that only the wizard can solve, or that they would need the wizard's help or knowledge or understanding to solve. But I think, and this is kind of the same if you look at how this plays out in a bunch of stories like this, a lot of the time it also ends up being beyond the technologically advanced person's understanding as well. In the Culture novels by Ian M. Banks, they call it an outside context problem. It is not something that we have any kind of framework for interacting with. It is entirely novel. And so one of the things that makes these books joyful to read is that you have this group of villagers who come to the wizard with a problem, and the wizard is all knowing, but then the wizard is also stumped, and so they all end up being leveled, right? Even though you would think there is a big differential between the advanced technologist and the medieval society, the end result is, whether through making friends or having a common problem that is beyond both of them, or plugging each other's sort of skills gaps, it ends up that this very, you would think, unequal relationship actually is much more equal than you would suppose.
Yeah, it kind of also allows the party to be greater than the sum of its parts. Like,
yeah,
you end up having a bit where the story's set up in such a way that you think the wizard is going to solve all the problems because they are just so much better at doing that.
Right.
But you come up with a conundrum that means that they can't do it without the assistance of the party. And the party could have never done it without the wizard.
Exactly. There's something that they're missing that only the locals can provide, and the locals are missing something that only the wizard can provide. So it's a like very teamwork oriented, or at least a story with a lot of options, a lot of affordances for teamwork.
Which lends itself very well to a party-based game.
It does. Cool. So we've got differing levels of sort of different viewpoints of the same phenomena of the same world. We've got a group of people with different skills who kind of need to work together, and they're probably working together against something that none of them understand and is going to need all of them to overcome.
Elder Race does this really well in that it has a before and after. This is not the first time the wizard has come to help the world. He did it in the main character's like great grandmother's era or something like that. And then when he's invoked in the present era, it's actually a very different set of circumstances. So we have the law in there that he's all powerful and can solve all problems. But in the context of the story we're exploring, he's not able to solve this problem, and we only find that out through play.
Yeah. I think the other thing that you kind of mentioned was when you're talking about like, oh, there's ancient machines and this has happened before, I think making sure that the wizard is never the only source of technological power and knowledge in these stories, right? Like there's always ancient artifacts scattered over the landscape.
With incredibly good user experience that teaches novices how to use them.
Yeah, or which activate on their own. Like the future is not evenly distributed. Or maybe it is evenly distributed. Like it is widely distributed. It's not concentrated in this one individual or set of individuals. There have to be like wizard artifacts strewn around the world for people with perhaps less benevolent intentions to get their hands on.
I do really like having like the arcane library with people who are devoted to certain artifacts and figuring out how they work, and it's them figuring out the buttons to press on the panel to get a certain effect out of it. Yeah. And knowing the rituals of putting it out in the sun to let it recharge at certain times. And
yeah, there's a really interesting, like, I forget the source on this one, but there's this fascinating thought experiment on like a microwave goes back in time and they use it as a reading light. And that's wondrous to them. right? Like, because you open the door and the light comes on. It's like, oh my God, we can study the scrolls all night. That's like, oh man, that's not even the
Not even what to do.
beginning of what it's for. That's just like a convenience feature. So there's a lot of...
That's just the wrong electromagnetism that it's putting out. That wavelength sucks.
It's like, you're not even using these things to their full potential, and they're already causing massive changes to your civilization.
I think that brings up another element as well. You have to have an established status quo that is delivered to you in world to show why the disruption is bad. Like, the world has to be worth saving, but you can't just jump in and be like, here is the thing, it's changing the status quo. Like, this is going to be significantly different if you don't know what the baseline is and you don't care about that. In Elder Race, like, that information is delivered through conversations and reflections of the fantasy main character. We get to see a chunk of the world from her perspective and what she's doing to, like, help the people who are suffering from the grand evil that's occurring.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are we ready to jump down? Like, do we have all of the things that anchor this type of story that give it its identity?
I think so. So we've got a diverse group of characters with very different skill sets working together. They achieve more than they could alone because they have sort of complementary skill sets. Our sort of big overarching challenge can only be solved by the team together and is maybe something that is beyond any of their understanding, even the future people. And we've got the idea that technology / magic is not isolated to the players. It's all around the world, and in the places where that futuristic technology interfaces with the fantasy society, that's where we get interesting disruptions, interesting problems, basically stuff for the players to solve, right? Because we're seeing the mesh of the smushing, technical word there, but the smushing of the wizards area of expertise, which is this high technology, with the locals area of expertise, which is the nuances of local society. And so the problem has come from a collision of both worlds, and so the solution, I think, also has to come from a collision of both worlds.
Yep.
I think as a unifying theory of how this kind of story works, I think that's actually quite neat.
We did it. We solved that crossover in the Venn diagram. So, with all that, how do we run this at the table? There's a question here that's been nagging at me that I don't have a clean answer for, and that's...
Hold on. Is it the same question that I have? No, you tell me yours first.
All right, B1. Do we say it together?
I don't want to try and synchronize that, so no.
So, is the wizard part of the party? Are the player characters medieval, or are they a mixture of both? Because there is a balance of, like, there's an information asymmetry that I think can be difficult to wield when you've got symmetric players at the table.
Yes. So I think I had a similar kind of question, but I was coming at it from a different angle, which was, do the players know that this is the kind of world that they're in? Do some of the players know and some of the players not know?
Yeah, similar
are
vibe.
all of the players on one side or the other? Because I think both can work.
Oh, yeah, that's true too. Like, you could have them all be the technologically advanced people interfacing with the primitive
and then
world.
you have a selection of NPCs in the party who are locals, or vice versa. I don't think vice versa is as fun, but I think it's doable.
Why don't you think it's fun?
Because so if you think about, like, what do I want from this as a player? What I want from this as a player is to do some science and have someone think it's magic, right? Like, that is what I am going into this game wanting to feel. And whether I'm role-playing it as, don't be ridiculous, it's not magic, it's merely the proper application of, universal principles, or whether I'm going into it saying, like, yes, I am a wizard.
Yep, the charlatan approach or the rationalist approach.
Right. Like, it doesn't matter how I'm choosing to riff on it as a character. What I want as a player is for people to be in awe of me.
So,
right? But That sounds silly, but like I want to be on.
not at all.
I don't want to be on the receiving end of being awed because that just feels like it's the GM grandstanding. I want to be.
Yeah.
I'm playing this game because I want to be the main character. And so I think it can work if it's all wizards, in quote marks, all technologically advanced folks. I think it's actually doable with a mix with some advanced people, some future people and some past people, which I will come back to in a sec because I think that's the really interesting sort of ground to play in. But I don't think it's super doable where you're all peons, because that's kind of the situation where you're all fighters and the game master's NPC is like the only wizard in the world. Like that's not...
Yeah, like
that's not
that
necessarily unfun because that's the basis of a lot of low magic type campaigns, but it's not the experience that I am looking for from this.
I think the
setup.
Natural mission that comes out of that is it's an escort the NPC mission. And
I think
the players might know that everything's actually technology. The characters don't know that. But is it actually fun to experience that way? You're like, oh, I see he's used the power of gun, but my character doesn't know that in world.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's
I don't
as
think
fun
that's
as
fun
when
to
you get to
roleplay.
do the grandstanding yourself and be like, I'm going to use the power of gun and tell them that it's magic.
Okay, hold on. So here is how it would be fun if you wanted to all be locals. You have to start the game, I think, as players, not knowing that that's how the world works. And through the course of play, you discover what's happening.
So we're playing it on two levels. The players are figuring out that actually these are just really mundane things in our world, but are huge in fantasy world.
So that discovery of what's going on, and I think to a large extent, learning to harness that, because you can't just like show them the toys and not give them the toys. Like discovering all of this stuff, finding all of this stuff, and figuring out that all of this stuff is merely sufficiently advanced technology. Like that has to be the whole game. Then you can't then have one sort of DM PC in the party as the wizard.
There's something that you've kind of brought up here. One of Grant Howard's one-page role-playing games that he designs in a podcast episode with Chris Taylor is Jason Statham's Great Vacation. Nobody plays Jason Statham. Jason Statham is a force of nature, and all of the players are being the people around him to maintain just the right levels of interaction, which in the form of the game takes, he always has to have just enough cocaine, but not too much. You've got to avoid him causing scenes at certain places, like the zoo, but he's got to be able to enjoy himself at those places. And I think that's kind of what it ends up being. Like, that's the game. That's what we
Babysit
know
the
is
wizard.
thing. Yeah. If you're all fighters or like local bards or whatever, and you're babysitting the wizard, I actually don't think it's as fun as Jason Statham's Great Vacation, because that has the like looniness built into it. But then we've got the interesting split case here where some of the party members know that this is just a technological world, and some of the party members are ignorant and think it's a fantasy world. And this one I think has a lot of potential for both great play and awful play. I think it could be the most high variance one, and you really have to know your players and pick and choose where people are going to sit on this in a way that will be satisfying for everyone, and not just like DM's favorite gets to know the secrets and they have all the power in the world.
Yeah, I feel like there's a really interesting like quadrant graph that you could draw, which is like has access to technology, does not have access to technology, and then knows about technology and does not know about technology. And I think the obvious ones are like knows about technology and can use it, and doesn't know about technology and can't use it. And like we almost want to be playing in the other two zones, which is like understands the technology but doesn't currently have access to it, but also is accidentally using the technology but has no idea that it is technology. They think it's actually magic. Like there's, as always, putting it on a quadrant graph and looking at where we're not.
Powers of visualization really help.
Yeah, like those I love putting things on a quadrant graph because it exposes the gaps or the combinations that you didn't think of. And I think this is a classic example of that. It's like, oh, we're just assuming that everyone who uses technology knows about it and vice versa. And that's not actually necessarily the case. And there's some really interesting bits to play within that. So I think there's two ways you can play it. Again, depending on your player group. I think you can have everybody in on the idea that this is the setting and rely on them to like play along, role play, if you will.
No, I won't.
Rely on them to like play along and play their roles and extract joy out of that. You can, I think, alternatively have nobody at the table know that all of the magic is actually science and reveal that over the course of the campaign through play. And I think you can have this middle situation where some of the characters know and some of the characters don't, but also some of the players know and some of the players don't.
Yeah,
and I think it could be really
fun.
I think that could be really cool, again, with the right group of players, to have like a couple of players in on the secret and then the rest of the play group is like figuring it out. I think that has the potential, those moments where people choose to reveal things, right? Like there's a lot of power in a reveal.
Yes. Like I would workshop this with the people who are in the know ahead of time. And I would try to think of like, if you've got an understanding of what abilities they're going to use, thinking of context clues that they work into their flavor when they're describing it to the other players. So almost like a suggested scenes kind of a thing. And I'd be like, you want to drop these like regularly, but not too often. So that the reveal happens early enough that the players don't feel like it's been a game played out for them, like a theater piece that you're doing at them. You want them to still come into the know when there's still the bulk of the session left, so that they can then work with the other players.
Yeah, and I think the more you can break down that reveal into nuggets that you can drop bit by bit, the more engaging it's going to be. So like maybe you learn separately that all magic is actually just science, and then also that the wizards are actually from a different planet or a different time. Like you learn those things separately, and that gives you just multiple shots at a fun reveal.
I mean, you're hard seeding the premise in there that it's like, this is an other, not from your world. So there's opportunity, there's reason to hook into that. You just have to have the players that can make that cue themselves.
Yeah.
Otherwise, as a DM, you have to sit there and be like, so what does Jennifer think of Barry being here? Barry is Space Barry and Jennifer is medieval Jennifer.
All right, so I want to think a little bit about plot now. What kinds of stories are we telling in this world?
I think the biggest one is an epic fantasy.
I think you're exactly right.
There is a journey, there are challenges along the way, and there is a huge climax scene against a foe greater than anyone.
Yeah, it is.
And the only way to solve that is not by fighting it. It's by thinking cleverly about your ability usage. In the same way that, like, you don't fight Sauron in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, exactly right. While the setting and the content can be very much science fiction, the actual arc of the narrative is a very traditional fantasy arc, and it is like defeat the big bad evil guy. It is a like capital Q quest. You're a capital B party, and you are like, the fact that that is a pretty vanilla storyline for this hobby is deliciously complemented by the fact that the characters and the setting have this like fun right angle sort of twist to them.
What are the scenes that you want to see on this one? I got some vibes. I want to see, there has to be a social scene with expectations and customs that are not being adhered to by the new folks in town.
Yeah.
Like there's got to be a clash of cultures.
Yep, I think a culture clash is a big one. Lots of opportunities for like making observations, and then how am I going to implement those observations to like try and continue to bluff my way through. Probably another big scene that I want is it's nobody's fault, but something has gone wrong scene. So like maybe there's some ancient technology that has, I don't know, it's poisoned the water hole, right? Or some fantasy / tech equivalent of that. And you just have to go out and solve an environmental problem that kind of has its roots in this out of place technology idea, but the problem is impacting a local community.
And it's beyond their ken, but not beyond the wizards in the party.
And there's opportunities for fake outs in there, right? Like you think it's technology, but it's actually just a guy pouring poison like down his well, or vice versa, right?
Yeah.
Like there's
if we're doing this in campaign play, I definitely have an element to subvert the trope.
Yeah.
But if it's like a one shot, I probably wouldn't. I'd want to stick to the established things.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I want a technology clashes with local society skill challenge, right? Something puzzly.
Yeah, extending this, I think there's also a great opportunity in there for the wizards can't just solve things by brute force, right? They are like a scalpel, but in some situations you need a club. And to get that club, it's convincing people, like convincing locals to band together. You do that through charlatanry, being like, oh no, like I'm the biggest, baddest guy in the room. Here's my magic. You should see it. And that's why you'll fight for me. Like there's opportunities in there to flex, but the bigger problem at play is the wizards need people on their side for some reason. They need bulk bodies, and they have to convince them to do that in a social structure that might be foreign to them.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. What else would I like to see? Again, maybe one for campaign play and not one-shots. I would like to see something that renders the wizards' powers inactive.
You want to subvert their power.
Yeah, I think that's a fun moment for the other players in the room, and importantly also I think a fun moment for possibly the player who's gotten used to solving all their problems with magic having to actually like think.
I think there's two layers to this as well, because the wizard is only as strong as people's perception of the wizard.
Yeah.
So if you take their power away, there's two layers of can you solve the problem still, and can you make it look like you're using wizardly power to do it even when you don't have access to it?
Yeah. Can you continue to bluff your way through being a wizard even when you're not currently a wizard? And can you enlist your mates to sort of continue the charade to actually solve the problem? There's good content there. I think probably the last thing, I mean, obviously I expect a big boss fight at the end.
Yeah, goes without saying. There has to be a climax. Maybe not like a true fight, though. I would consider it more of a problem-solving expedition. So rather than just like rolling dice to hit or cast spells / do tech, I want to see it more as a like the thing that you're encountering can't just be solved with brute force.
Yeah, and I think everything in the game has to be solvable with a combination of the player's skills, right? And like maybe that should be the case for every game, but I think especially this is a genre that especially kind of wants you to play in that way. And so yeah, it's designing enemies as challenges or challenges that are going to need something from everybody to get them to work.
If we touch back on the source material for this one, right? In Elder Race, the party consists at the very end of the traveling linguist who can communicate and trade with all of the people, the fighter who is the main fantasy or medieval woman. She's got a good sword arm. She knows how to use swords. She's very into like heroic actions and living out the role of the heroine in the story. We've got the wizard, and they later pick up like the local guide who's seen the thing.
Yeah, /rogue I would put in as well.
He is literally a thief.
Yep.
So with each of those people there, they have an opportunity to shine with their particular skills to solve the problems at hand.
Yeah, absolutely. The traveler, diplomat, linguist one gets a particularly cool moment where I think, unfortunately, off screen, they have just like been eavesdropping on the wizard sleep talking, and they know enough of his language, and there's enough like common linguistic heritage that they are able to tell the drone the word for home, and the drone like carries the wizard back to like very cool.
We end
moment
up having the not technology person using the technology by casting the wizard spell.
Yeah, exactly. And I think as a secondary kind of endpoint to work the story towards, or to sprinkle opportunities in there towards the climax of the story, as a component of the climax, like giving the non-wizards opportunities to like have a little taste of wizarddom, I think is really adds
you
to
could see a couple of context clues along the way for like, this is like a universal panel, and you see the person pressing buttons like this.
Yeah,
it gives you access.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think it's like your primary goal, but I think they are things that you sort of sprinkle in there as options for the players to pick up. And if they do pick it up, that would be a really cool moment for everybody.
I think so. I think that'd be a great story beat to hit. All right. So how would we string this together into an adventure? Right? We've got some really good scenes. We've got some good elements that we want to bake into it, and we know the kind of anchors and identity for the story. If we were to like sit down at the table, we're facilitating a session of play. It's about 4 hours long. What's the opening scene here? Let's assume, for the sake of all of this discussion, that we're going to go with a split party where some are wizards, some are not, and the information is asymmetric across them.
I think this is a really perfect opportunity to go with the dumb tropes. Like, I think you can straight up have them like
knocking on the door of the wizard's tower.
Knocking on the door of the wizard's tower, like there's a mysterious stranger in the tavern. Like, you can start this thing off as something that seems like one thing, because we know that over the course of the story it's going to develop into something that is not what it seems. And like, the thing you want people to be able to do is to go back with the knowledge that they kind of have at the end and reevaluate the things that happened at the start of the game.
So we're looking to seed some things that on reflection are different to what you first thought.
Yep.
I would want to start this one with the mundane characters have already gone on a quest for the wizard's help. And the first scene is the introduction of like a group of characters who know each other and have a bit of banter already with this new alien figure or figures. And it's them like stepping out of their world across a threshold to the mundane world. So like, we've taken the wizard out of the element, and now they're in the mundane world playing by those rules.
Yeah.
That the rest of the party is anchored in and kind of knows the traditions of, knows the customs.
Yeah.
And then we start with the epic quest from there.
I think the interesting part of this story is not the travel. I would probably go for like almost hopping from town to town, and all of the interesting stuff happens in or around the towns, because the fundamental tension in the story is between magic/technology and the local society. And for that tension to come into play, you need to be in a part of the local society. Like, you imagine what a wilderness encounter would look like, right? And it's like, oh, well, you're just fighting a robot in the forest now, right? That's not playing on the fun parts of the genre. So I think we are basically hopping from town to town, or hopping in and out of one town.
Is one of the encounters in that town, like you brought up the water supply is poison kind of thing. Is it the water supply is usually clean because there's a pump and filtration unit on it?
Yeah.
And it's now
broken,
seized, or it's leaking something, and it's a moment for the wizard characters to kind of sacrifice something that they have to fix that.
Yeah, I think so.
It's not just like, you roll to fix it, great, it's fixed. It's it needs these components, and you have them in your console.
Yeah, but if you fix it, you won't have that anymore. Yeah,
You
I think
won't have
that's
it anymore, but you will have gained the trust of the town, and the people that are in there would do something for you.
yeah, and I think that's. I mean, I think you've accidentally stumbled on another like fairly core element, which is that as well as the locals getting closer to the wizard as the story goes on, I think there's also room for the wizard to get closer to the locals. That might mean they're developing attachments, which they're not, supposed to or didn't start off with, and suddenly they have stakes, at play. There could be like an emotional closeness, but I think it could also be a literal like the power levels close as the local members of your party acquire fragments of tech or fragments of knowledge, but also as the wizard sacrifices stuff, toys to protect or save the people who they didn't previously have a connection to. And it turns out like that's actually more important than the toys.
I like the idea of right at the very start, each of the characters has like story hooks where like they've lost a loved one to the big bad, or they come from a town that the big bad has now consumed. They have motivations that are driving them towards that, but the wizard player doesn't. And they build theirs over the course of the story. Yeah, I think it would be fantastic even if you had some mechanical reward for that, where it's like by doing this, you do gain like another member of the party, an NPC follower, or something that's gonna really come back and assist you and allow you to do things in a way that you weren't capable of doing before, but to do it, you pay the heavy cost of losing some of your advanced tech.
So you kind of have a gradient where like the wizard starts the game with a lot of toys and no friends, and the locals start the game with a lot of friends and no toys. And over the course of the game, those become, I think, more even. So the wizard maybe has to give up some toys, and the locals maybe gain some toys. But the wizard in return gains some friends, and like maybe your little band of locals start to be seen as outcasts. And that's kind of the trade-off that you're all making, right? Because you're one who consorts with wizards and such. You're no longer seen as part of the society. You're no longer fully trusted. And so you've taken a step into
shifty things with the magic man.
Exactly. You've taken a step into the wizard's world, and you are now like no longer fully trustworthy in the mundane world.
Absolutely love that.
I think it would be a very cool one to play as a longer campaign, because I think it's a very cool one to be able to watch these players or watch these characters develop.
Man, it would be amazing. I know we don't design systems, but it would be amazing if you had like a mechanical score for this, that if you're doing like a dice roll add modifier thing, for a local, you just have an automatic, you add this to your modifier and it's positive. And for the wizard, it's negative. And as you interact with the world, those modifiers come to be more even over time, representing the locals becoming more distant or less trusted because of their flirtation with technology, and the wizard becoming more grounded in that world and able to communicate more effectively with the inhabitants of it.
Yeah, so that's probably a good segue, actually. Shall we talk systems?
I got two that spring to mind immediately.
Yep.
The first is Worlds Without Number by Kevin Crawford.
Yep.
And Worlds Without Number is just a fantastic book. I will shill for this book any day of the week because it just has such incredible world building tools in it. But its setting kind of has an element of this baked in that it's a fantasy game, sure. It's wholly compatible with his sci-fi game, Stars Without Number, because they use the exact same math chassis under the hood of a, it's effectively an OSR style game. But the magic in this world is from a, field of nanobot things that's so old and has had so many updates and changes and patches to it that using it is effectively casting a spell. And different planes of reality exist. They're like multiverses, but you can access them through manipulating the rules of physics by doing effectively magic. So it blends those genres already, and it gives, if you needed a maths background for these players to kind of fit together in the same world, and the fighter has purpose and the wizard has purpose, this one kind of balances that a little bit. And it maintains some of the great OSR tropes of trying to solve problems, not with your character sheet. And combat is not the first tool that you deploy.
Yeah, I love that. I don't think I'm necessarily going to be able to top that. I'd probably go for a different approach, which is to zoom all the way out and run it in something like... I'm trying to think if I would run it in Savage Worlds, but I think I would probably run it in Fate.
That's no surprise.
I'm like, just learn Fate. Just learn Fate and run everything in Fate. It'll be easier. No, I think super generic systems are uniquely suited for this because you don't have to have rules about how the magic and the technology and the whatever. You don't have to have rules for how all of that interacts. You can just let it be what is most interesting for the story.
And we are very heavy story gamers.
I think so. I think that's apparent by now. But yeah, that's what I would do. I would run it in something like Fate. And that gives you a really neat opportunity to do exactly what you were talking about, where you can give the players something for giving something up. So Fate relies really heavily on trading Fate points for taking essentially a disadvantage. So it's like, hey, if you want a Fate point, like, you're going to let the DM do something bad to your character. And so I think it somewhat uniquely has this ability to like reward the wizard for giving up their toys built in, because when you give up a toy, not only do you advance the plot, but the DM is also like literally giving you a plot affecting point back to power some of your other powers, or to power
literal ability to use swing momentum back in your favor.
It makes doing that trade for everybody much more appealing, because on top of the narrative components of like, well, yeah, you'll get this, but you'll lose this, but it will advance the plot. It's like, but also I will literally like pay you meta currency to do the thing that goes maybe against your interests, or maybe isn't like optimal for your interests, but is like the most interesting thing for the character and for the game. So I think just purely based on I wish we could do a system where there was some way to like do this trade-off. I'm like, I think Fate does that quite neatly. The other thing I would consider doing, which also kind of answers the traditional next question, is just running it in D&D.
I mean, D&D 5e does have the perfect flaws in the system to run this type of game.
I think all of the
wizards literally change reality already and have a massive power imbalance over fighters who swing sword.
And I think this neatly hooks into a lot of the issues that I know you and lots of people have with 5e, where it's like, none of this is internally consistent. None of this makes sense. Like, why has society not been reshaped by magic? Like, dragons make no ecological sense. Like, all of this.
Oh boy, don't they? They don't make sense on meta levels, on narrative levels, or on mechanical levels. They're like a shitty onion.
We have not got time.
Stay tuned for a future episode of Jordan rants about why I hate dragons.
But this is like such a perfect, slightly tongue-in-cheek way to be like, well, this is why all of the lore and systems attached to that lore in this game are so busted, because like they're not meant to be here. Like, I've always found the concept of D&D's like spell list so weird, when magic in a lot of other fiction is quite freeform, and D&D it's very like it's based off like it's based off like the specific works of an author who pretty much no one has ever read, and in like all of the rest of fiction, and magic is much more mysterious and much more freeform, and much less like selecting items off a drop down menu. And I was like, well, maybe the reason it's like selecting items off a drop down menu with a limited power supply is because it's literally wizards are selecting items from a drop down menu with a limited power supply. Like, it's
suddenly there's verisimilitude and I'm in.
right? Like I think running D&D like this actually fixes a lot of the problems with D&D.
It does, by leaning into the problems and telling the story you want.
So I'm gonna commit a cardinal sin and tell you about my D&D game.
Oh God, Rocky, we know what this is like. For everyone else, one of Rocky's favorite sayings is telling someone about your D&D character is the same as telling someone about the dream you had last night.
It's just not interesting to anyone except you. But I'm going to break that rule because we actually did play in a game like this for quite a long time, DM'd by a good friend of mine. We just used I think it was very early 5e, may even have been like pre-release 5e. And we played it as the oops, all normies option, I guess, where over the course of the game, we discovered that we were actually living inside a sci-fi construct called an O'Neill cylinder. And that the gods were like AIs in the spacecraft's network. And the magic that we were using was like activating the local ambient nanite field. Had lots of elements of like Halo lore in there where AIs are very close to gods. And it also had strong influence from a web series / novel called Ra. By a writer called Sam Hughes, who goes by the web name QNTM. Quantum. And he has this fantastic way of doing magic where like magic is basically programming. And it is done by like thaumaturgical engineers.
Magic has rules.
Yeah. And so like as we advance through the levels and as we delve deeper into like what was actually going on in this, what we initially thought was a fantasy world with, it's like, oh, well, it has a different moon and like a different sky and like whatever. That's just, what the plane is like. And like as the game progresses, it's like, oh, you're in the middle of like a spinning cylinder in space and the gods are machines and the magic is powered by, nanobots. And yeah, it was a very, very cool game, but we just ran it in 5e because the flavor doesn't actually need to interface with the mechanics at all. And in fact, if you are playing this game where it's kind of seems to privilege the science a little bit, playing it in a system which is built to privilege the fantasy side a bit more, kind of balances things out, I think. So it can actually be really fun to run in 5e, and I would maybe even go to that as one of my top choices to run something like this.
Very controversial.
I know. Hot take.
I would say there's a couple of things that I would automatically want to change.
Always.
For 5e. First is like, I probably wouldn't allow every class. I would choose the ones that map well to this type of fantasy. I think Warlock especially, because they deploy their magic in pretty short bursts. They do their thing, and then they need a rest for a recharge of that, and they can't just sling spells all day long. So I think that kind of fits this vibe really well. You don't want to have the character who's like, no, I'm Magic Man and I do magic whenever I want and it solves every problem all of the time. Warlock still has to be clever with how they deploy it. Yeah. And Warlocks being like high charisma, natural charlatans. So it really fits that vibe so cleanly.
Yeah.
Whereas something like Druid, I don't think I'd want to include unless you have like a real specific in-universe reason why you want to have this person who's like a genetic morpher shapeshifter.
Yeah, I think you've got to lean into that and like biotech side of things.
Is that they have so many things at their disposal as well, where it's like just being the shapeshifter would be enough to be a cool wizard in a low fantasy setting. But they also have full spellcasting ability on top of that as well.
Yeah, and I think that's ultimately what like one of the great ironies of this is that like actually the amount of tech required to be a wizard in these people's estimation is not high, and the number of toys that the wizard has is like not many, and they are often not very impressive. And they are things like they don't need to sleep, or like they heal supernaturally quickly.
They can produce fire at a whim. Not an inferno, just like a cigarette lighter.
Yeah, it's like little things.
Little things used cleverly.
And so like, yeah, it doesn't take a lot to be a wizard. And so I you're right. I think the power level of the druid is just like too much. I would almost say, like, don't have wizards, just have bards and flavor them as wizards, right? Like, I think the bard hits about the right level of quote unquote power, magical power, to be the kind of wizard you see in these stories.
And magical healing, of course, is one of the big ones where it's like, oh yeah, we just have real good medicine that can heal you as you're being wounded. And the bard fulfills that quite nicely. Like, I drop a med kit and you get 25 HP. So I think we've done a pretty good job wrapping this up, right? We've got some nice tropes, some nice anchors. We can lean into an epic fantasy quest that is about interactions with culture and people, with like an asymmetry along people who can interact with that versus people who can solve quote unquote wizardly problems.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's a very topical type of game. You know, you've got some people who understand the technology and some people who don't, and the technology is slamming into the society at
breakneck
with
speed,
unintended
with disastrous
results.
consequences.
Yeah.
It's changing the status quo, and the people that live in this world are fighting to save that status quo.
Yeah. Too real. But no, it is. I think it could be like super fun and super resonant. And the themes keep showing up in fiction for a reason. Because it's fun to have toys, but it's also fun to have friends.
Yes. On that note, please be our friend.
Yeah.
Please share our podcast with your friends. Tell them to get on this wagon as well.
Yeah, send it to your DM. And this episode in particular, send it to your DM and ask them how magic really works in your setting. And maybe you'll come in a couple of sessions' time, you'll find out that it was in fact nanites all along, as I once did. I can recommend it as an experience. So send this show to your DM. If you are a DM, send this show to all of your DM friends.
That's our episode of Platonics. I hope you enjoyed it.
We will catch you next time.
Peace.
Boy.
Boy.
All right. That's a show.
That was good shit.
That was a good show.